I have spent more than 2 decades in the field of criminal investigation, and in all that time, only a handful of cases have managed to carve themselves into the deep corners of my memory. Most murders are brutal. Some are bizarre, and a few are complicated puzzles, waiting for the right detective to decipher them. But there are rare cases that possess a way of pushing past the boundaries of routine policing cases that force you to look into the darker architecture of human nature. The Gilgo Beach murders, and the man later suspected of being responsible, Rex Andrew Hoyerman, belong to that category. This is not simply another homicide file sitting on a shelf. It is a portrait of silence, a study in predation, and for years it was the ghost that haunted Long Island. The beginning of the case did not resemble the opening of a serial homicide dossier. It began with a single frightened woman and a phone call placed in the dead of night. The date was May 1st, 2010. The hour was just past 3 in the morning. The woman was 24-year-old Shannon Gilbert, a sex worker who operated independently, mostly through Craigslist. Her voice on the recording is something that never leaves you once you have heard it. It carries the trembling clarity of someone who knows she is close to death, but does not yet understand who's trying to kill her. Her words were disjointed, panicked but unmistakably real. "Someone is after me. Please help me. He is trying to kill me." The dispatchers tried to ground her, tried to pinpoint her location, but fear turned her speech into fog. She ran. She hid. She begged. Then the line went silent. When units were deployed to search for Shannon, no one predicted that her disappearance would become the crack in the facade of a much larger horror. At the time, it was a missing person case involving a young woman with a history of escort work, and to be candid, those cases tend to sit lower on the hierarchy of urgency. That is not how it should be, but reality inside policing is not immune to human bias. The search extended over days, then weeks, and long after hope had thinned out, a canine officer made a discovery that changed the trajectory of the investigation forever. The body he found was not Shannon's. The remains lay partially concealed in thick beach grass along Ocean Parkway. The dunes there have a way of swallowing sound and sight. The air carries mist from the Atlantic and deposits it across the sand like a shroud. It was the kind of place that could hold a secret for years. When the crime scene team secured the area and unearthed the first set of bones, there was already a sense that this was not the end. That feeling proved justified. Within days, 3 more bodies were found within a short radius of the first. 4 young women, 4 escorts, all missing for years, all with similar conditions of disposal. The public would later know them as the Gilgo 4. To us, they were the first proof that a hunter had been operating on Long Island. Their names were Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Lynn Costello. I did not know them personally, but I came to know them through the files, through the photos on the wall, through the patterns carried in the final hours of their lives. They were not statistics. They were individuals who walked into the orbit of a man who understood how to choose victims society failed to protect. Their disappearances formed a pattern that hindsight would make painfully clear, but at that time each case had been investigated by different precincts at different times with varying levels of urgency. Maureen disappeared in 2007. She had traveled from Connecticut to Manhattan hoping to earn money and return home soon after. Melissa vanished in 2009, and her case still claws at the stomachs of even the most hardened detectives. For weeks after she disappeared, her younger sister received mocking phone calls from a man who claimed to have Melissa. The calls were calm, controlled, and executed with the deliberate cruelty of someone who enjoyed the family's suffering. Those calls were traced to a cluster of cell towers near Massapequa Park, but back then, that information alone could not crack the case. Megan disappeared in 2010 after leaving a hotel late at night. The last grainy footage shows her stepping outside and dissolving into the darkness beyond the camera's reach. Amber vanished later that same year after being lured by a client who displayed an unusual insistence on hiring her again. 4 women found within a quarter-mile of each other. 4 stories ending in the same desolate stretch of beach. There are moments in this job when coincidences stack in such a way that only a fool would continue to call them coincidences. This was one of those moments. At the time, I was not yet assigned to the case, but like every investigator in New York, I felt the gravitational pull of what was unfolding. Behind the scenes, the detectives working the beach began to piece together that the same individual might have contacted all 4 women through burner phones. The problem was the technological limitations of that era. Data retention policies were different. Cellular triangulation lacked the precision it would gain a decade later. A killer with patience and discipline could maneuver around the cracks in the system, and that is exactly what he did. For 13 years, the case drifted, not dead, not cold, but suspended in a limbo created by insufficient evidence and bureaucratic turnover. Leads were pursued and then abandoned. Tips came and went. Teams disbanded and reassembled. The beach remained the silent witness no one could interpret. Meanwhile, the man responsible lived inside a quiet suburban neighborhood, commuting daily to his job in Manhattan, designing buildings, attending school meetings, participating in the mundane rituals of normal life. His name was Rex Andrew Hoyerman. At that moment, he existed only as a ghostly possibility inside our files, a hazy silhouette behind a curtain we could not yet pull open. The truth is, we did not know his name. We only knew someone out there was skillful enough to hide beneath the rhythms of ordinary life. When the case was resurrected in 2022 under a newly formed task force, I was brought in because of my experience with long-form homicide investigations. The first thing we did was revisit the oldest data with new tools. There is a principle in investigative work that every unsolved case contains its own solution buried inside the evidence, waiting to be reinterpreted by someone with a fresh perspective. That principle proved true here. The burner phones used to contact the victims had left footprints, faint ones, but still detectable. Each call connected to towers near 2 distinct points. One was Massapequa Park, the other was Midtown Manhattan. 2 geographical anchors, a home and a workplace, a pattern beginning to sharpen. It is important to understand how a serial offender like this operates. He chooses victims whose absence will not provoke the kind of immediate large-scale search that comes with other demographics. He contacts them through systems designed for anonymity. He picks them up in areas without persistent surveillance. He kills them somewhere he feels safe. He disposes of them where the environment will protect him. And then he monitors the aftermath to ensure the police are blind. This level of organization is not impulsive. It is methodical, almost architectural, which is ironic considering what we would later learn about Hoyerman's profession. When I stood on that beach for the first time as part of the new task force, I felt the heaviness of the years that had passed since the victims were left there. The ocean carries both life and decay. The dunes hold secrets and return them only when forced. The air had the same cold emptiness described by the officers who found the bodies over a decade earlier. Nothing had changed. It was as though the landscape itself had preserved the crime scene, waiting for justice to finally catch up. The new investigation focused on cross-referencing the earliest cellular records with modern mapping algorithms. When the data points began clustering around one particular residential neighborhood, we finally had a nucleus of suspicion. Yet we still needed DNA. And DNA does not appear magically. It must be found, collected, preserved, matched. The victims had been wrapped in burlap. Fibers were present. Hair fragments were present. Among them, a hair that would become the pivot on which the case turned. The strand belonged to a woman. It did not match the victims. It did not match the officers. Through genealogical analysis, it matched the wife of a man who lived in Massapequa Park. That man was not home during the times the victims were believed to have been murdered. But hair transfers easily. A killer who moves bodies can inadvertently carry hair from home to crime scene. The probability narrowed. The silhouette in our files began to take shape, and the name attached to it was Rex Heuermann. Before the arrest, we placed him under discreet surveillance. We needed his DNA. One evening he sat down and ate pizza, then discarded the crust into a public trash can. We recovered it within minutes. The samples extracted from the pizza crust matched the DNA from the burlap associated with the victims. The ghost finally had a face. This is where episode 1 closes. Not with the arrest, not with the courtroom, not with the final verdict. Those belong to later chapters. This first chapter belongs to the beach. The silence, the long years of uncertainty, and the first moment in which the threads began to pull together. Every serial homicide case begins with a moment of rupture, a point where the ordinary world fractures and something unseen slips through. For Gilgo Beach, that rupture was a terrified woman running in the dark, calling for help, unaware that behind her screams lay the buried truth of 4 murdered women and a killer who thought he had outsmarted time. This is the beginning of the story. And as I, Detective Miller Files, would learn in the months that followed, the truth was far wider, far colder, and far more calculated than the public ever imagined. There is a moment in every long-running investigation when the pieces, once scattered and contradictory, begin aligning in a way that feels almost unnatural. You stare at the evidence, the timelines, the phone logs, the forensic traces, and suddenly the fog that has smothered the case for years begins to lift. It does not lift quickly. It does not lift cleanly. But it lifts. And in that first flicker of clarity, you realize the truth has been sitting there all along, waiting for the right set of eyes to see it. When the name Rex Andrew Heuermann emerged as a potential suspect, what struck me first was not how terrifying he appeared, but how extraordinarily ordinary he was. There is a dangerous comfort in assuming that evil wears a certain face, that killers are menacing figures with visible fractures. But the reality is much more unsettling. The most sophisticated predators are those who learn to mimic normalcy so perfectly that even their own families cannot sense the darkness simmering beneath the surface. The first time I drove past his house in Massapequa Park during surveillance, I saw a modest 2-story home standing between identical suburban structures. The siding was old, weather-worn, and in need of repair. A cluttered yard suggested a man whose life was more functional than aesthetic. Nothing about the property whispered danger. Nothing hinted at the possibility that the man inside might be responsible for some of the most haunting murders in Long Island history. If I had not known we were tailing a suspected serial killer, I would have assumed the homeowner was a quiet, aging architect who preferred familiarity over flair. But that was the point. He hid in plain sight. Through the windows we could sometimes catch glimpses of him. A tall, broad figure with thick glasses, often wearing the same weathered coat, always moving with an air of indifference. He was not paranoid, not visibly anxious, not showing any of the classic behaviors of a man who fears discovery. That composure was the first signal that we were dealing with someone who believed wholeheartedly in his own invincibility. And why wouldn't he after more than a decade of freedom? While our surveillance deepened, so did our research into his background. Rex was an architect with a registered firm in Manhattan. He worked on commercial renovations, zoning issues, complex building compliance problems. His colleagues described him as meticulous, methodical, and occasionally abrasive. They also described him as someone who kept to himself, someone whose private life was inaccessible even to those who worked beside him for years. The irony was impossible to ignore. The man who designed physical structures for a living had spent at least a decade constructing a psychological architecture that concealed his guilt. Every serial killer has a mask, and this was his. The more we studied him, the clearer it became that organization defined every layer of his existence. From the burner phones to the victim selection to the disposal site, nothing about his crime suggested spontaneity. He operated with an almost mathematical detachment. He knew where to hunt, whom to hunt, and how to ensure his victims disappeared into a landscape that could guard his secrets. He understood that marginalized individuals would not elicit the same urgency from police departments already strained by resources and politics. He exploited that knowledge with chilling precision. Technology had evolved since the early days of the investigation, and what was once inconclusive now became revealing. We reanalyzed the cellular patterns surrounding the burner phones used to contact the victims. The same geographical choreography kept reappearing. Calls made near Rex's home. Calls made near his office. Calls made near locations his wife and children never visited. Calls placed at hours that aligned almost perfectly with the timeline of the disappearances. The data no longer whispered suspicion, it spoke clearly. Still, suspicion is not proof, and proof is the only language a courtroom understands. That is why the DNA mattered so much. When the genealogical analysis confirmed that one of the hairs found on the burlap belonged to Rex's wife, it reshaped the trajectory of the investigation. It did not make her a suspect. Investigators quickly confirmed she was out of town during all 4 murders. But that fact made the hair even more important because its presence on the victims meant one thing: the killer carried it with him from the house. That kind of secondary transfer happens when someone moves in the same environment, brushes against the same surfaces, wears the same clothes. The killer lived with her. The killer was Rex. The task force began building a timeline around his movements. When we charted his work schedule, his vacation days, his known whereabouts, we noticed a disturbing symmetry. Whenever his wife and children traveled, the burner phone activity increased. Whenever he was home alone, the patterns of communication with the victims intensified. The dates of the murders overlapped with those windows. A man who kills only when his family is away is not impulsive. He is calculating. He is compartmentalized. He lives 2 lives simultaneously and ensures the borders between them never collide. To understand Rex, we needed to step into his psychology. This was not the frenzy-driven pattern of a chaotic killer. This was strategy. This was ritual. This was control. And control is the defining trait of a predator who kills for domination rather than emotion. To the outside world, he was a provider, a father, a man who attended architectural conventions and dealt with clients in skyscrapers. But beneath that mundane veneer existed a darker identity he had cultivated for years. The internet searches found on his electronic devices painted a grotesque portrait. He researched torture fantasies. He obsessively studied news articles about the Gilgo Beach case. He Googled details about decomposition rates, police investigation techniques, missing sex workers. He even looked up relatives of his victims. That kind of predatory curiosity reveals the pathology of someone who not only kills, but keeps the memory of his crimes alive as a secret trophy. Trophies are common among organized killers. They are psychological souvenirs, anchors to the thrill of the act. In some cases, they are physical objects. In others, they are digital trails. In Rex's case, they were both. One of the most unsettling realizations during the investigation was how comfortable he felt living parallel to his crimes. He saw the press conferences, he saw the public fear, he saw the annual reminders that 4 young women had been found by the beach. And yet, he continued life as if none of it concerned him. He returned to the same house, drove the same route to work, ate at the same diners, maintained the same job. He did not move away. He did not change his habits. That level of psychological dissociation is rare. It is the kind of mental split that allows a man to design buildings by day and bury women by night without ever feeling the need to run. But even the most careful killers leave a trail eventually. The pizza crust was what finally exposed him. It is almost poetic in a grim way that something as mundane as discarded food became the thread that unwound an entire case. When our team collected that crust and sent it for analysis, we held our breath, and when the lab returned, the match linking Rex to the victims, I felt a familiar mixture of relief and dread. Relief because justice finally had a direction. Dread because we were not merely confronting a suspect. We were confronting the culmination of 13 years of horror. Before we moved to arrest him, we needed to be certain we had enough evidence to sustain a prosecution that would withstand every challenge. We dug deeper into his financial records, his travel history, his online activity, his property logs, his work correspondences. Every layer we peeled away exposed something more unsettling. There were hundreds of firearms in his home. There were hidden storage spaces. There were dark web connections. There were eerie gaps in his timeline that suggested he might be connected to other disappearances beyond the Gilgo 4. We could not prove that yet. Not then. But patterns rarely lie. As the evidence mounted the night before the arrest weighed heavily on me. Every detective knows the anticipatory anxiety that comes before taking down a suspect of this magnitude. We were dealing with a man who had evaded law enforcement for more than a decade by being disciplined, controlled, and methodical. There was no guarantee he would surrender without resistance. There was no guarantee he did not have weapons within reach at all times. And there was no guarantee that he would not attempt one final act of violence. But the operation had to proceed. The morning of the arrest was unusually bright for Manhattan. The sun reflected off the glass towers, creating sharp beams that cut across the sidewalks. The city felt awake, indifferent, unstoppable. It was a striking contrast to the quiet suburban street where Rex lived. As I stood with the team preparing to move in, I thought about the victims. I thought about the 13 years of unanswered questions. I thought about how fragile justice can be when the truth is buried beneath layers of normalcy. Rex stepped out onto the sidewalk that morning, carrying a briefcase, preparing for another day as if nothing in his life were unusual. The choreography of the arrest unfolded with precision. Officers converged. Commands were issued. His reaction was not shock. It was irritation, as if we had interrupted something routine. He said little. His eyes darted briefly, not in fear but in calculation, as if he were trying to understand at what point his architecture of lies began to collapse. For me, the arrest was not a moment of triumph. It was a moment of gravity. It marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Because once the suspect is in custody, the real questions emerge. How many victims are there truly? How many lives did he touch in ways we have yet to uncover? How long had he been hunting before the world discovered his existence? Gilgo Beach had given us 4 answers. But I suspected the truth extended far beyond the dunes. Episode 2 ends here in the tension between revelation and uncertainty, between the arrest of a man and the vastness of the crimes he may have committed. Justice had taken its first real step. But the investigation was only beginning. When a suspect like Rex Heuermann is taken into custody, the public imagines that the work is over. They imagine a dramatic scene in which the villain is unmasked, dragged into a police car, interrogated under bright lights, and forced to reveal his secrets. But those beliefs belong to television, not reality. In real investigative work, the arrest is not a climax. It is an opening, a door finally cracked just enough for us to push inside and confront the enormity of what lies within. After Rex was taken into custody, his silence was immediate. It wasn't the silence of fear or guilt. It was the silence of a man who had spent decades rehearsing for the moment he might be caught. I watched him in the interrogation room through a one-way mirror. He sat in the metal chair, hands folded, breathing steadily, almost bored. He looked like a man who believed that the world could not touch him, even as the walls began closing around him. Interrogating someone like Rex is an art form in itself. You cannot pressure him the way you pressure impulsive killers. You cannot agitate him into cracking. You cannot lure him with sympathy or provoke him with anger. He is too deliberate for that, too insulated by years of emotional detachment. With him, the approach must be architectural, deconstructive, systematic. Every question must be a structural challenge to the identity he has built. Every silence must be a calculated pressure point. Every pause must carry weight. A man who has lived 2 lives does not confess easily, but he does reveal himself in the contradictions. We asked him about his movements, about the burner phones, about the timelines, about the women. He evaded questions without resisting them. He answered without offering answers. He used the kind of verbal fog that highly organized offenders employ to exhaust investigators. But I never expected a confession. Serial killers like Rex don't confess because confession destroys the narrative they have constructed for themselves. Their crimes are not acts of desperation. They are acts of identity. And Rex had spent years convincing himself that he was untouchable. While he sat in custody, our real work began outside that room. The search of his home was unlike anything I had ever seen. Investigators describe crime scenes as speaking to us. The Heuermann home did not speak. It whispered. It gave hints rather than answers. Every drawer, every closet, every floorboard seemed to contain a sliver of something that might matter. His bedroom closet held dozens of firearms. His basement workroom held storage boxes labeled with codes as if each one represented a private chapter in a life he never shared. There were hard drives, some encrypted, some damaged, some hidden behind false panels. There were folders filled with architectural diagrams that seemed unrelated to his crimes, yet somehow significant, like artifacts from a life he used as camouflage. The most unsettling part of the house was its duality. The upstairs living area was chaotic, cluttered, almost neglected, but the basement, the place where he spent most of his solitary hours, was disturbingly organized. Tools arranged with mathematical precision, boxes stacked according to an internal logic only he understood. Every corner looked like a workspace created not for building, but for hiding. I walked through the house slowly, feeling the chill of a place lived in by someone who had mastered compartmentalization. Serial killers, who live double lives, often construct physical spaces that reflect the separation between their 2 selves. Rex's house was that reflection. The ordinary world upstairs, the dark interior below. The family environment on one floor, the solitary fortress on another. As we continued to search, the digital evidence began to reveal more than the physical. His online history was a descent into every corner of human cruelty. He had spent late nights reading about unsolved murders. He had searched for victims whose disappearances matched the exact profile of his known victims. He had monitored forums discussing the Gilgo Beach case. He had studied the investigation he was trying to evade. He had followed the families of the women he killed. His mind was not merely engaged in the physical act of murder. It was engaged in the narrative of murder. It was a performance, a story he continued telling himself long after the acts were done. As detectives, we often ask how a man becomes capable of such things. But in cases like this, the question is not how. It is how long. How long had he been fantasizing about control? How long had he been practicing the art of deception? How long had he been constructing the life that allowed him to kill without suspicion while evidence mounted, the community began to react? The neighborhood where Rex lived was shocked. Neighbors described him as quiet, almost invisible. They talked about how they saw him mowing his lawn, going to work, carrying groceries, waving politely. Some looked guilty for not noticing anything unusual. Others were defensive, insisting that nothing about him hinted at darkness. Their reactions reinforced a painful truth in investigative work. Evil rarely announces itself. It adapts. It integrates. It becomes familiar. The most terrifying killers are those who learn to blend so seamlessly into the rhythm of everyday life that they are remembered as ordinary. As I spoke to neighbors, reporters, and community members, I found myself thinking often about the victim. The world tends to forget them when the killer becomes the story. But in my line of work, the killer is not the center. The victims are. The women whose lives were cut short deserved more than to be overshadowed by the man who hunted them. Their stories deserved completeness. Their identities deserved dignity. Their deaths deserved answers. Investigative teams recovered more items from Rex's possessions. He had thousands of pages of search histories, some dating back years. He had printouts of news coverage of the murders. He had maps marking areas around Long Island that made us question whether he had been eyeing other locations for disposal. He had notes handwritten in code, listing dates that did not match his work records or family schedule. Every piece of evidence seemed to suggest that the crimes we knew about were only one part of his story. The question that haunted me most was simple. How many more the Gilgo Four were confirmed? But what about other remains found along the same coastline years earlier? What about other missing women whose disappearances overlapped with periods where Rex had unaccounted travel time? What about the bodies dismembered rather than wrapped? What about the clusters of unidentified remains found between 1996 and 2010? Patterns do not lie. They only hide until someone shines the right light. As we pieced together his digital and physical life, a disturbing timeline emerged. Rex's behaviors escalated over time. His searches grew more violent. His communications became more secretive. The burner phones increased. He began researching sadistic content at levels that signaled psychological deterioration. The precision of his crimes suggested he had practiced, and practice implies earlier attempts. The FBI psychologists who consulted on the case told us something that stayed with me. Organized killers devolve. They do not escalate in chaos but in sophistication. Their crimes grow more meticulous, not less. They refine their methods. They sharpen their strategies. They adjust their patterns in response to risk. That means the Gilgo Four may not have been the beginning. They may have been the perfected version. As Episode 3 unfolded in real time, our team prepared for something both inevitable and overwhelming. We knew that the arrest was not the end. We knew that every discovery revealed 10 new questions. We knew that behind every answered question stood another woman, another disappearance, another file that could suddenly come into focus. One night, after reviewing hours of footage and data, I drove alone to Gilgo Beach. The wind was sharp and the sky above the dunes was a flat, indifferent gray. I stood on the sand where the victims had been found. The ocean sounded like static, a low hum that blurred together grief and time. I thought of how the killer had stood in the same place years earlier, believing he had erased them. But the earth remembers. The ocean remembers. The wind remembers. Crime scenes never truly forget. They simply wait. Standing there, I realized what scared me most about Rex. It wasn't the brutality of his crimes. It wasn't the length of time he spent free. It wasn't even the possibility that he had more victims. It was the way he had lived among us, unremarkable, unnoticed for decades. It was the way he had constructed a life that allowed him to kill without ever having to look over his shoulder. It was the silence he carried, the silence he lived within, the silence he expected the world to maintain for him. Episode 3 ends not with resolution, but with awakening. The arrest shattered the illusion, but the truth was far larger than one man and 4 victims. The truth was that a monster had lived in the suburbs, surrounded by people who saw nothing because they were not looking for something that hid so well.